The Red Death had long devastated the country. No sickness had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its manifestation and its avatar. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and a sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding from the pores. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially the face of the victim, would shut him out from the aid and sympathy from his fellow men. And worst of all, the whole seizure, progression, and termination of the disease happened within just half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and clever. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned 1,000 friends, and with them retired to the deep seclusion of one of his towers, girdled in by a strong and lofty wall and gates of iron. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, the prince provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons and actors, ballet dancers and musicians. They played cards and drank wine, and there were beautiful women. Inside, there was safety and comfort. Outside lurked the Red Death. It was towards the 6th month of seclusion, and while the virus raged furiously abroad, the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed the embellishments of the 7 chambers of the tower, and there were much glare and glitter. The rooms held much beauty and extravagance, much oddness and terror, and even things that could make one feel disgusted. These apartments were so irregularly disposed, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre, that there was a sharp turn every 20 or 30 yards. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a private corridor which rounded the suite. These windows were of colorful stained glass, and the chambers changed to match their hues. The eastern extremity was vividly blue. The second chamber was purple in panes, along with its ornaments and tapestries. The third was green throughout, and the fourth was orange. The fifth white, the sixth violet. The 7th apartment was shrouded in black velvet that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decor. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. There were no lamps or candles within any of the 7 apartments, but in the corridors, opposite to each window, there was a heavy torch that glaringly illuminated the room. In the black chamber, the light that streamed upon the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon those who entered that there were few bold enough to set foot within it at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when its minute hand made the circuit of face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came forth from the lungs of the clock a sound so clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note that at each hour the musicians in the orchestra would pause in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the dancers ceased their revolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, the giddiest grew pale. But when the echoes had ceased, laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, and then, after a lapse of 60 minutes, there came another chiming of the clock, and then were the same as before. Throughout the 7 chambers the partygoers moved, shifting and contorting, taking on the colors of the rooms. Then strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of velvet, and momentarily all is still, until the echoes die away, and again the music swells. But none of the maskers would venture through the room with blood-colored panes and black drapery. The other apartments were densely crowded, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length the clock sounded, and the music ceased, and the waltzers ceased their revolutions. Now there were 12 strokes to be sounded, and before the last echoes of the last chime had sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had become aware of the presence of a masked figure not previously seen. And the whispers of this new presence arose at length from the whole company, a murmur, first of surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and disgust. The figure was tall and gaunt and shrouded from head to foot. The mask most perfectly resembled the face of a stiffened corpse. His clothes were dabbled in blood, and his broad mask was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image that stalked among the waltzers, he was seen to shudder either of terror or distaste, before his brow reddened with rage, and the music became hushed at the waving of his hand. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the group around him in the blue chamber. "Who dares thus to make mockery of our woes? Unmask the scoundrel, so that we may know who it is that will hang at sunrise from the battlements. Stop him and strip him of those stained robes of sacrilege. Will no one obey my command?" These words rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. At first, as he spoke, there was some movement in the direction of the intruder, who now made closer approach to the prince. But none put forth a hand to seize him, so that he passed within a yard of the prince, and made his way uninterruptedly through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, along to the white, and even thence to the violet. It was then that the Prince Prospero rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers with a drawn dagger, and when the intruder left the velvet apartment, there was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming on the carpet, upon which fell instantly in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning their wild courage of despair, a crowd of revelers seized the tall figure, who stood erect and motionless in the shadow of the ebony clock, and cried in unutterable horror at finding the corpse-like mask did not cover any tangible form. The Red Death had come in like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-sprinkled halls and died. And the ebony clock went out with the last of them, and the flames of the torches expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held dominion over all.